Hit Wicket is the cricket game backed by Harsha Bogle and me, so you know it's full of nerd energy. This strategic cricket game isn't just about frantic tapping. You make decisions based on how cricket actually works. You've got to set a batter up, right? And you can't hit a six from the first ball. Hit Wicket knows all that, and they made a game that makes it work with a few gaming twists in there as well. So play, build, and manage your team, because you are the batter, the bowler, the coach, the selector. I mean, you're basically everything in this game, right? And there's no ads on Hit Wicket. So download it for free for mobile and unleash your inner cricket legend.
Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to episode 68 of the Footmarks podcast. I'm your host, Behram Qazi, who you can find at DefMango on Twitter. And with me, as always, is Jarrod Kimber, who you can literally find everywhere. And the title for today's Footmarks is Deconstructing Babar Azam's Decline, which kind of speaks for itself. And Jarrod, I want to start with basically segmenting Babar Azam's test career, right? We have to look at it in three parts for all of this to make sense. And he starts off poorly, averaging 20 odd in his first year and a half as a test cricketer. And he scores his first ton in his 17th test. Then he goes on to experience a purple patch for the ages from 2018 to 2022. At the peak of the pace-playing pandemic, mind you, when quality batters are being undone by the wobble seam delivery left, right and centre. And Babar Azam is basically unperturbed, and by the end of 2022, he brings his test average close to 50. And in the 20 months since, he's done worse than that initial period, in which he started off, and he cannot buy a run even, in Rawalpindi, which is staggering. And he's averaging below 45 now in tests. What a weird career trajectory, which not many would have seen coming.
No, I think the thing I find weird, and you will have followed it closer. So I really notice him more through ODI cricket, right? Which is where he's having his success. But as a Pakistani fan, you'll be following it on both sides. And there's that thing, if you're not following a team really, really closely, and you see someone having success in one format, you just assume that they're doing well in kind of everything. And so it's only really maybe just as he starts to make test runs. I realize he's never made test runs before. And look, he's not the only player ever to struggle in international cricket when they started, right? Like a lot of players do. But the interesting thing for him is how bad he struggled, for how long, while he was dominating international bowlers in another format.
Yeah.
Right. So I can't think of another player who's quite been that bad in tests and that good in ODI at the start of their career as a younger potential, superstar, which is what he was at that point. And then he has this peak, and I've never asked you this. Is Babar his actual real age? Like, are we assuming he's roughly? Yeah. Okay.
From what I've been told, he's his proper age.
So if we look at it from a peak perspective, which we like to do in our sort of stuff, the early stuff we can say, well, he was very, very young. But then he goes to an absolutely ridiculous peak of 3 or 4 years, as you said before, in an era when no one else is making, it's like him and Marnus making runs, right? Yeah. No one else in the world is making runs at that point. And then when he actually starts to approach his peak, he goes into a massive, massive decline. And that is not a normal pattern. If you compare it to, I'm just doing this off the top of my head, but someone like Joe Root. Joe Root, struggles a little bit at the start of his career. England uses him as an opener for a while. All sorts of things happen. But he's not averaging 20, right? Like he's not averaging under 30 for a long period of time. And then he has a peak, and then he dips in around 27, 28 a little bit. But again, he dips to what you would say is a normal test batting level, right? Yeah. Babar has got 2 periods in his career where he's got like the average of a number 8, and one period in his career where, and the longest period of his career, where he has the record of someone who's going on to be in the top 50 batters of all time. Yeah. So when we started our book, looking at that list, Babar and Marnus were both on our list of, we didn't think either would make it just because they didn't have the body of work to compare with everyone else. But we also had to look at their record and just make sure by the time we actually started writing the book, their names weren't even on any of our lists anymore. Do you know what I mean? Like they had both dropped off so far. And that as I said, going into your peak, that's not usually when you have your biggest issues, right? Even at your peak, you would expect to be just maybe, you keep it ticking over. So yeah, it's bizarre. The whole thing is really, really bizarre.
Yeah, I mean, during that purple patch, everyone got super excited as well. And it was quite a big one, 2018 to 2022. So you've got like 4 to 5 years in there. And he went from being one of the best batters in the world in that period, who many people used to compare with the Fab Four, or they used to take his name in the same breath as the Fab Four, right?
They were trying to put him in the Fab Four. And what I would say at the time is the Fab Four is more about 4 great batters coming from the same age bracket.
Yeah.
And people were really upset that we weren't all putting him in, but it was like, no, he's on his own. He's separate to the Fab Four.
Yep.
But you're right. There were lots of people who were saying things like he should be in. And you look at the numbers. 2018, he averages 56. Then it's 68, 67. He has a bit of a down year in 2021, or it's 34, and then he's back up to 69. Those are, Virat-like numbers, right? Like that. There's a period where Virat has a very similar stretch, maybe without the 2021 in the middle. So. Yeah. I could understand the moral argument for being in the Fab Four, but the actual overall thing didn't make as much sense.
Yeah, no, I'm with you over there. People did used to take his name in the same breath as those 4 batters. Let's just say that. And from there, he's gone on to become this batter who can't even score runs in home tests, right? Yeah. That's the startling bit. And granted that 6 of Babar's 9 test tons have come in Pakistan and the UAE. I think 5 or 6 have come in Pakistan and 1 have come in UAE, something like that. And in his golden period, his numbers more than hold up away from home as well, considering that it is a catastrophic fall and a nosedive, really. So, here he is averaging, albeit in a small sample size, over 50 in England and Australia between 2018 and 2022. And now he can't score versus Bangladesh at home in Rawalpindi of all places, right?
Yeah, and so I do think there is this idea that he only makes runs at home, which is not quite true. But when it comes down to it, he's not making runs anywhere, right? So at the moment, you're in a situation of like, you can't even pinpoint him going on tours. So yeah, it's not something that we see all that much. It is something that is quite dramatic and quite violent, I suppose, is a way of putting it.
Just on that, you said that how a lot of people think that, he is a bit of a home track bully or scores versus lesser teams, for the lack of a better word. Contrary to the moniker given to him by his haters, which is Zimbabwe, he scored 2 runs in as many innings versus Zimbabwe in Test cricket. So he's averaging 1 versus Zimbabwe. So that's a bit of a myth over here, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think if you look at his overall record, Babar is really well respected in Australia. And like, let's be honest, Australians only watch games that are like on their TV in home, right? He hasn't made a lot of test runs in Australia. I think he's made 100, but that 100 was really highly rated. He made 1 or 2 hundreds in ODI cricket as well. So, Australians are not particularly, bullish on Pakistani batters in general until they become legends, right? He's made runs in England as well. He's made runs in Sri Lanka. So he's got like a varied record. New Zealand, I think he's got some runs. So it's not a home and away thing. It's not like suddenly, sometimes you go through those periods where you tour for like 3 years and then you play like 15 games in a row at home. And so your records are completely skewed by that. That's not what has happened here, right? Like you can't, even if you say he's not as good away from home as he is at home, which I think is a very, very good argument. And there is elements of that within his record.
Yeah.
That isn't what has caused this crash.
And basically the theme over here is that in his golden period, he was good everywhere. Sure, he was better at home, but he was averaging really well away from home. And in these poor stretches, he's been awful on literally every venue where he has played, home or away, which is basically, what we mentioned in the piece as well.
Yeah, so if you look at the away record, 2018, 2019, 2020, and 2021, he's still averaging, I think it's 55, 45, 48, 36, and then 67, right? In the away matches in those years. So we're not really talking about here. And I think there are separate arguments to be had for Babar Azam, the away player. And, it's something that we noticed quite a bit in Australian players and Pakistani players that they, I think Cheyenne and I have started calling it the 60-40 split for Australian great players. You look at a player from Australia and he averages 50 and you're like, wow, he averages 50, 60 at home, 40 away.
Yeah.
And it was so many, and it's not just Australians, but there's a lot of Australians who have that kind of split.
Kane Williamson has that kind of split as well, doesn't he?
He does.
Yeah.
1 second, sorry, mate. Oh, it's just nope, it wasn't her. And so, yeah, there are lots of players around the world who have that kind of split. I think that's a separate issue for Babar. But when he was at his best, it is not an issue at all. Right? When he's at his best, playing away from home is an absolutely he slaughters away from home. So the real issue for him is what is actually happening in those periods. He's basically either a world-class batter, or he's a number 8 who's got lost and stumbled up the order with a really nice day. He's either Kagisa Rabada, right, who can make Mitchell Stark's runs, right? Or he's a person that people want forced in the Fab Four, and there's no middle ground. So, you look at, just to go back to the away record, he averages 28 and 20 when he's starting off, when he's really bad. And then the last 2 years, over 5 test matches, he's averaging about another 22, 23 in those away games, right? So, and in the middle, I just went through the numbers. The numbers are fine in the middle. Like a Pakistani batter averaging 55, 44, 48, 36, 67 over 5 years. You take that any day of the week. Like that's a record for a Pakistani batter to have on the road, and a Pakistani batter at that stage on the road to greatness, right? So so weird that it's just all shut off everywhere.
Just before we kind of break into his career and see all the different things that have happened and, there's certain comparisons, I want to just double down on this because a lot of people on the internet, call Babar Azam overrated. So I wanted to kind of, focus a bit more on his uber purple patch, which was between 2018 and 2022. And only Joe Root and Ben Stokes had scored more test runs than Babar in that period, and we all know how many tests England play. And then amongst batters with at least 1,000 runs, only Kane Williamson and Marnus Labuschagne averaged more. If we look at match factor, Babar was at 1.62 in this period, which in layman terms means that he was 62% better than all other top 6 batters in this period in both his team and the opposition. And as far as Pakistan batters are concerned, the next best scorer was Azhar Ali, who was 1,000 runs shy of Babar's tally. So it's not like the hype was, not real in that period. He did look like he was destined for greatness, and then that's when he falls.
If I'll just bring up Virat's record here. Virat averages 22 in his first year of test, and then 49 straight afterwards. So he recovers his really, really well. So he goes, when was his purple patch? Is it 2016 it starts? So 2016 onwards, he averages 76, 55, 68 before he's dropped. So that's 4 huge plus years in a row. And that cements Virat Kohli's greatness. But that comes after he's had a couple of years averaging around 50 beforehand. And then he has this great thing. The difference with Babar Azam is that we have 2 years of averaging 20, right? And then we have 4 years that, and it's 4 out of 5, so it is a little bit more messy. But we have 4 out of 5 that compare to, some of the great periods. Maybe I would say, like, if Kohli's reign there is like, a 9.5 out of 10, then Babar's is like a 9 out of 10, right? Like it's just a slight step behind. You don't make those numbers just at home, right? Even Australian, and even when David Warner was in his purple patches, it was generally still making some runs away from home. Like there has to be something else. And the idea that he was overrated, it's like it wasn't. He was for 4 years one of the greatest batters in the world, without any doubt, right? Yeah. Like probably in that period, top 3, top 4, without any questions at all, right? And that's over a long period of time in a difficult period where great batters are stumbling all around him. Yeah. I really want to impress that the problem, and we've done a whole episode on Babar Azam before. The problem with Babar Azam is there's this pro Babar wing of people online. And so because of that, there's an anti-Babar wing of people online. So and they just talk absolute trash.
either he's the best thing since sliced bread or he is the worst batter to ever play for Pakistan. There is no in between. That is basically Babar FC versus anti-Babar FC. But you mentioned...
And so I just want to, just on that. So it basically, that whole conversation messes up everything about Babar. Whereas actually, when we go through it, it's a far more interesting story. And I think that is a reason that there's a lot of this overrated. It's because he was treated like he was Lionel Messi, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, and his numbers were suggesting that's the path he was on. At that age, to have the averages that he had, and also to be averaging, 60 in ODI cricket, he was statistically on the path to being, if not the best Pakistani batter of all time, but at least in the top 3 with me and Dad and Yunus at that point.
Yeah. And you mentioned Marnus earlier. It's actually crazy how similar Babar's career trajectory in Test cricket is to Marnus Labuschagne. They both start poorly, right, in Test cricket. Then they dominate in the pace-playing pandemic. From 2018 to 2022, they are indifferent to the wobble seam delivery, only to drop off in recent times. Now, they average high at home overall and in the mid-30s away. It's quite uncanny, isn't it? All of it.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about those two players is that they're very different paths. Like, Marnus wasn't supposed to be a great player, right? Like, he gets picked as a leg spinner, essentially. Was he batting at number 7 against Pakistan, I think, in that Test series?
It's that UAE tour.
Yeah. I mean, I say gets picked as a leg spinner the same way we say Cameron White and Steve Smith got picked as leg spinners. They weren't really leg spinners, but they were there because they could bowl and weren't considered top order batters at that point. He then disappears a little bit, goes off to, was it Glamorgan? I think it's Glamorgan where he makes all of his runs, isn't it? Completely changes his career as a player through that period and comes back and is a star. Whereas Babar fails, but because Babar is so good, Pakistan just keep playing him. So we see his weakness. We see him struggle in a way that Marnus wasn't even in with the side, right? But then, as you said, they come back. And I think I have always had this theory especially with Marnus, that I would throw in maybe someone like Daryl Mitchell here, and perhaps even Babar Azam, that their styles, I think, help them in certain ways against the wobble ball, whereas the players who are already playing cricket, right, and who were already established, the wobble ball was actually aimed at the way that people were playing at the top level. So you see, even like someone like Tom Latham, you see these guys come in that period, and there was a few of them who made runs, maybe slightly more, slightly different techniques and everything else. And so Babar Azam, my memory is that he was batting very deep in his crease, and he starts batting. So Babar Azam and Daryl Mitchell both start batting intercepting the ball miles away than anyone else. They were when I looked at this list ages ago, they were 2 of the guys with the furthest interception point wicket. And with Babar, it's standing out of his crease, and with Daryl Mitchell, he's freaking tall, and he takes that little step sometimes beforehand. And then Marnus is something different. But the point being is, I think they just had something within them. That's not saying that any of those, and we'll throw Marnus back in there again. I'm not saying any of those 3 players, or Latham as well, are not good players, because I think they all are top level players. But I think they had something in that period that helped them play that delivery better. Whereas actually, you probably would bowl differently to them. Right, you're probably looking at bowling slightly differently to them than that standard delivery. But the fact that after a while, people do probably change the way that they bowl to those guys, right? You do go back to a different thing. I think plays a part in it, but it's a fascinating thing to say a player isn't good when they dominate a bowling era. And it's also a fascinating thing that both of them have had their drop-offs in Marnus and Babar. Literally, as they should be hitting their peak ages, they have done that. And so, it's a very similar careers overall, considering one player was always considered to be a great, and the other player was kind of a battler who got in through county cricket.
Yeah, it's fascinating, really, how in years that are supposed to be the peak years and golden years, that's when the decline has come. And all things considered, though, between Marnus and Babar and the comparisons, there is one thing which is dissimilar between the two. Babar debuted in first-class cricket in December 2010, and Marnus debuted 4 years after that, Jarrod. And despite the head start, Babar Azam has only featured in 91 first-class matches, whereas Marnus has played 152. So that is 61 more games. Marnus, recently turned 30, and Babar is almost 30. By the time this podcast comes out, he probably would have already, crossed 30. Maybe. I'm not sure. And 91 games is not nearly enough red ball cricket for a 30-year-old professional batter who has been in the system for 14 years.
So the video that we made, and you and I obviously made it together with Sean and Varun. I think I made the joke the other day. It was like a sitcom writing team. There were so many of us involved. That came out of a conversation that we had on an Uncovered or an Overtones. Yeah.
Yep.
And if you remember, I was looking all this stuff up in real time.
Yes.
So I somehow managed to compare him to Marnus in real time and get that bit right. And then we started to look this up. And I remember us seeing those numbers and just being like, is that right? Like I looked at them twice to make sure I wasn't looking at something incorrect. It's not a lot of cricket. Now, he's played a lot of white ball cricket in that time. Although, he's not a franchise player, is he? Like, it's not like, he has 400 T20 games. He's not one of those guys who's just bouncing from league to league. So he's played 300 T20 games and 183 white ball games. So you're talking about someone who's played 500 white ball games and 91 first class games. And perhaps what we're seeing in Babar is one of the first generations of players who is probably a test player who can play good one-day cricket. I think those are his two strengths. Like, I don't think he's not as bad as people make out in T20, and he wasn't as good as people made out at his peak in T20, right? But you look at his main skills, and Test cricket and ODI cricket would make the most sense. And in ODI cricket, 183 games is still not a huge amount. Think about, okay, who would be a Pakistani player of a previous, like from the 90s or 2000s? And I'm wondering what kind of ODI cricket they would have played. Right?
A lot, right? Because 90s was ODI heavy. I mean, Inzi might be a good one to look at.
Yeah, so Inzi has 458 list A games.
Yeah.
Right? So, and obviously there's no ODI cricket at that stage, and 245 first class games. Right? So
you mean to say T20 cricket?
Hey?
There is ODI cricket, no T20 cricket.
What did I say? I said list A cricket, didn't I?
Yeah, but there was ODI cricket back in that day.
No. So he plays 378 ODIs, and he plays about another 80 list A games. So he doesn't play a lot of domestic white ball cricket. And then he plays 245 first class games. About half of those are test matches, right? So he has. You look at that and you think about the actual length of a T20 game and an ODI game, right? So he, even in those one-day games, what's he averaging? 45 in one-day cricket, something like that? 40 in one-day cricket, right? So not quite the same level as Babar. That's a lot of balls.
Yeah.
Right? So in international cricket alone, we're talking about him facing 30,000 international balls, right? If you look at Babar in international cricket at the moment, you're talking about 12,000 balls, right? And he's 30. He could be retired in 4 years, right? He's Pakistani, so he won't be, but he could be retired in 4 years, right? It's not a lot of international balls. And then you go to the domestic side of things. We don't have all of the Indies domestic balls, but it's going to be, it's at least double. He probably faces somewhere around 60,000, 50,000 deliveries, right? And Babar just isn't anywhere near that level at the moment. He's faced 28,000 professional balls, and he's not getting the amount of deliveries bowled to him that you would expect of a player who is 30, who has, when did you say he made his debut? 14 years ago?
Yeah, 2010, December 2010.
So he's 14 he's 14 years into his professional career, and he's not faced a lot of deliveries. And it's we're starting to obviously see this trend come through, right? Yeah. And Babar might be, think about 2010. That is when T20 takes over.
Yep.
Right? That is when T20 becomes the more important side of things.
Also, Pakistan has played a fuck ton of bilateral T20s, more than anyone else, really. That's what they kind of focus on, which doesn't make sense either. Hasn't helped him.
Yeah, exactly. So his main format of cricket is T20s, and he's played 304 of them, which is, if you compare that to, that's more than double what he played in first class cricket and list A cricket. And then if you go across to Marnus's record, and you start to have a look at Marnus. Now, Marnus has never really been a T20 player, right? So I'm not saying he hasn't played it, but he hasn't been a T20 player. So Marnus has faced 21,000 balls in first-class cricket, right? So that's a huge lead over of Babar. And then he's only faced 3,700 in List A cricket and 1,000 in T20, right? His career starts 4 years later, and yet comparatively, when you look at all the different balls that we're talking about here, you're talking about 28,000 balls for Babar with 4 years before, and he's been at the top level of cricket for a lot longer, compared to 25,000 balls for Marnus with 4 years less. So he is, and he hasn't always been, he's not a first choice player, right? Like, he wasn't a first choice player for his state team for a long period of time. And so you start to compare this and you're like, the amount of balls that Marnus is facing that are challenging him in first-class cricket is so much higher than Babar, when the majority of balls he's ever going to face are going to be him strike rotating in the middle of limited overs games. So there's like a development miss here that someone like Marnus doesn't have. And Marnus isn't the same level as as a batter, right? He just isn't. But there's a development missing curve now that we are getting with someone. And Babar might actually be the poster child for that, where he's just not getting enough. And, you look at his record over the last couple of years, and I think we did this live on air as well when we were going through it. He actually, I don't think, is it this year he hasn't played a lot of, he hasn't played, he played 2 ODIs, Babar, in 2023. And he hasn't played any ODIs in 2024. So
no, well, I mean, he would have played more in 23 because of the ODI World Cup. So
wait, am I looking at that wrong? Am I looking at tests? I thought I had ODIs. Wait, did I get that wrong? Sorry, wait, I might have looked up the wrong number.
That's okay, because he played at least 9 games in the World Cup, right?
Why? What is this? This is not ODI cricket. Oh wait, I'm looking away from home.
Yeah.
Sorry, you're right. Sorry, he's played no games this year. That's the so he played 25 in 2023. But you go back, so 2019 he plays 20, then he plays 3, 6, and 9, and then he plays 25, right?
Yeah.
So outside of World Cup years, Babar Azam doesn't play a lot of ODI cricket. And then you go to Test cricket. He's never had a year he's played 10 Test matches. He played 5 Test matches last year. And in 2022 is the most he's ever played, which was 9, right?
Yeah.
He doesn't have these huge levels of cricket that he is playing when it comes to longer format games. And specifically for him, the formats that he's best in.
Yeah. It's interesting how, his era has coincided with the T20 era, as you've mentioned, and he's played T20 cricket the most and not as many long format games. Do you think there is a correlation with that fact and his conversion rate? Because that's another aspect that needs to be looked at, right? It's a conversation that has haunted Joe Root before he went absolutely berserk, in recent times. And Babar is also on the shitty end of that plunger, if you will. He has 35
the shitty
plus...
end of the plunger.
Yeah,
we've all been there.
Yeah, of course. He's got 35, 50 plus scores, right, in Test cricket, and he's got 900s. So he's basically the anti-Yunus Khan when it comes to conversion rate.
Yeah, and so what that does really is, when you have a dip in your career, it's a lot more noticeable when you haven't been making hundreds before. So, when we were looking at that period where I said he was averaging sort of roughly just under where Virat Kohli was. If he converts at a Virat Kohli or a Yunus Khan type level, he's probably 75 and 80, right? Like, the 150 plus scores are the ones that really affect your average. And so you see players, Mark Waugh is one of the most famous ones of this, Mark Waugh it wasn't just about conversion for him. He got to 100 and just got out, right? But he never got the 150s, the 200s, the 250s, even the 300s that made a big difference.
Even Babar has the same issue. His top score is 196, so he's never gotten a double, and he's not used to scoring daddy hundreds.
Yeah, and that's another part of it. And you go back, and you're right, the limited overs cricket might play a small part in this. Remember, I had this theory about the Indian batters just before they got really good. So I can't remember what summer. It must have been 2012 when I covered them across 2 different countries. And I had this theory that like these guys were not used to actually making grinded out long innings. And so they didn't play first class cricket, right? So a bit like Babar at that point, they weren't playing a lot of first class cricket. They were playing a lot of limited overs cricket where a 70 is absolutely fine. And even if you get to 100, by the time you get to that point, you're trying to kick on, right? So you're playing a different kind of innings. And when they played tour matches, they would quite often, India had this random thing where they wanted everyone to have a bat in tour matches. And so guys would quite often retire between 50 and 120 over and over again. And you could see it. And I went through all the different times you could see this happening. And they were doing it on purpose to give everyone warm-ups for the games. But they weren't allowing their batters to bat between 70 and 150, right? Which is a different style of batting and different things that you need to learn. So again, Babar is in a similar sort of situation. Even an ODI 100 is not quite the same as a Test 100. You know, you look at someone like Jeff Marsh. Jeff Marsh would just accumulate, get to 80, and then maybe he'd try and hit a couple of boundaries in the last 7 or 8 overs. Jeff Marsh didn't have a great record in Test cricket, but he could do that in ODI cricket. So it's a different kind of batting. Yeah. So I think there's an element of this again of he doesn't play a lot of first class cricket. He doesn't actually bat on all that much. And there's nothing really within his game that suggests he's not patient or anything. So he should be converting 50s to 100s at least a normal level, right? Let alone probably a batter like him, I would say maybe even above that, right? There's no reason for him to be getting out. He doesn't have like a Shane Watson thing where he gets stuck. Right? There's no way to really get him stuck or anything like that. He's not that kind of a player. He should just be going on. So again, that feels like to me a development issue where he hasn't quite developed that skill. And, we talked about this before with someone like Zach Crawley. Zach Crawley hasn't developed the same way that most test batters do. Most test batters make a shit ton of runs. Then they get picked. And so they understand run scoring. Zach Crawley is more like a lab batter. Right? Like technically he has everything he needs to be successful at the international level, but he's not used to scoring runs. So have a look at the amount of times he gets to 70 and almost gets confused. Yeah. Right? And Shane Watson is another player I would put in that sort of thing. That you get the players who are not used to that and they don't know what to do at that level. Well, Babar Azam shouldn't be one of those players, but you look at his record and you go, maybe he could be another one of those players.
It's interesting. I mean, I hadn't really thought of this from this angle before, but it completely checks out that because Babar has played so much T20 cricket, maybe that's the reason behind the conversion rate not being as good. It would have actually improved the piece had we linked those two things together. But anyway, it's also crazy, and you've alluded to this earlier as well, how Babar's highs are extremely high and his lows are ridiculously low. So he has a career average in Test cricket of 44 and a half, but he's never averaged around 40 in a calendar year, which is what brings me to your cluster batter theory, which we have been talking about for quite a while now. Like it's been a good 2-3 months since we've been having this conversation. And you have mentioned to me all through this while that Babar might be a cluster batter. And what that means is that someone who basically tends to go on a run scoring spree until that run scoring spree dries up entirely. And it then starts again, the runs start pouring again. And if you look at his career, even if in his first class days, when he hadn't played Test cricket yet, he starts off poorly, goes on a bit of a high in first class cricket domestically. Then there's a slump, which also coincides with the start of his Test career. Then he goes on an insane high, and now it's the most recent slump, right? And there are other batters throughout history who have similar, patterns like Mike Hussey, Dennis Compton, Usman Khwaja. They're all examples of cluster batters. But to prove this theory correct, Jarrod, Babar would need to go on another run-scoring spree, no?
Yeah. I find it very hard to think that at the very least he's not going to have another 3 years of averaging 45. Like... Jimmy Adams is a player who probably maybe not quite a cluster batter, but a batter who in his mid-20s was one of the best batters in the world, and by his late 20s was kind of washed as a Test match batter. But there were injury stuff there, like he got hit in the head with a bouncer. I've talked to Jimmy about it before. He thinks psychologically he sort of broke. There was problems within the team, and also the umpire started giving him out LBW. So his method of scoring runs level changed because the umpires are like, no, we're onto you now. We've worked this out, and we don't want that. So I think there's a few things there, but there aren't really players usually who go to the level of Jimmy Adams or Babar Azam who never make runs again.
Yeah.
Right. So
Jonathan Trott comes to mind.
But Jonathan Trott, you're talking about Jonathan Trott in 30, what would he have been? 33, 34.
True, he was quite old at that point.
We saw Jonathan Trott basically at his peak. When he starts playing Test cricket, he's at his peak. And then he finishes. And then we probably see him as he starts to struggle, and makes sense. We see the struggle start with fast bowling, which, it's usually spin or fast bowling where the drop-offs come straight away.
Yeah.
And so again, that's a more normal arc, what we saw of Jonathan Trott. What we don't usually see is someone who dominates from 23 to 28, and then never learns how to make runs again. And especially if you have, I would say, even like with Jimmy Adams, there was a technical issue, right? Yeah. The way he played, there was a technical issue. Babar Azam is not a technically flawed player. Like I know we're going to get onto the toes and all that sort of stuff. He's a technically flawed player, right? He's a very technically correct player. So again, you would assume at one stage he just gets a bit of confidence back, starts seeing the ball better, it comes onto the bat, and he does that. So I could be wrong. And if it is wrong, it's one of the more fascinating stories in the history of Test batting. But for someone that good in that period of time. But it isn't something that you see all that much unless there is a technical flaw that is worked out, or, as I said, a bunch of different factors happen, and that person, completely collapses and just isn't of that level ever again. So I don't think that is something that is likely to happen. So I think, and it may take him, it may start tomorrow. It may happen in 6 months' time or a year's time. But I think eventually he's going to come back and he's going to go on another spree. Now, whether it's a 55 to 60 averaging spree or whether it's a 45 averaging spree, I don't know. But he's going to go through a period in Test cricket where I think he's going to average a big chunk of runs over a 2 or 3 year period, which then would then even more firmly put him in the category that we're talking about here, of guys who, when it works, they're just absolutely magnificent. And when it doesn't work, they don't know what to do.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? And I'm going to hold you to that, of course, because we're all looking closely at Babar now, and we're keen to see whether or not the cluster batter theory checks out. But apart from cluster batter, there is another term that you have used with me on the live show, I believe, to define Babar, which is rhythm batter. And you've basically said that, we've got rhythm bowlers in cricket, right? Stuart Broad, Mohammad Siraj, Hassan Ali even, and throw in Shamar Joseph more recently. They are unplayable on their day and mediocre otherwise, or not just as good. And what I want to ask you is that you feel that this also kind of implies that, batters go through the same thing, and Babar might be one of those batters, a rhythm batter, such that when he is on a run, he is going with the flow and he doesn't really know what he's doing good. In terms of getting all those runs. And similarly, when he's not doing well, he doesn't know what he's doing wrong. So he's quite clueless in that regard. He just goes with, the rhythm.
Yeah, and I think, I think what we did when we were talking is we compared him to Stuart Broad. And Stuart Broad's a really interesting one of everyone in English cricket, and this started with the team. This wasn't a media thing. It started with a team of like, Stewie's got his, Broady's got his knees up today, right? And by that, what they meant is he was pumping his legs really, really hard, which gave him momentum and rhythm. When he hit the crease, magic balls would come out. So Trent Bridge, right? All these great Stuart Broad spells that we're aware of, in South Africa and, at the Oval against Australia when his breakthrough performance and all this sort of stuff. And then we've all seen Stuart Broad come in and just bowl powder puffs, right? Now, Stuart Broad is not a dumb cricketer. I think he's one of the more, especially as a fast bowler, I think he's a really, really smart cricketer in many different ways. He couldn't work out how to get his knees pumping, right? Yeah. Whereas you compare that to Curtly Ambrose and to Glenn McGrath, other tall bowlers. What days did they come in and you go, they don't have it today, right? It just never happened. Their best ball on their worst day was still really good. There was they didn't amp up and amp down. Now, Curtly and Glenn McGrath would get fired up at times and take it to another level where they were godlike. But I watched a lot of Glenn McGrath and Curtly Ambrose bowl, and their stock bowling was of such of a higher level than Stuart Broad's was, which is why they've got bowling averages in the low 20s, right? And he has a bowling average in the high 20s. That's the difference. Their best days aren't that much different. Broad's best days aren't that much different than Ambrose and McGrath's best days, right? But Broad didn't know how to be a consistent threat. He didn't know how to do that because he didn't understand that simple thing of how to find those magic days, right? Mohammad Siraj is another really good example of that, as you said before. Shimar Joseph might be another one, a younger version that we're seeing coming through now. We talk about it a lot with bowlers because it's really noticeable because you can quite often see it in the run. There are some days when Mohammad Siraj has so much energy on the ball where you're just like, good luck hitting that, buddy. And there are other days where you're just like, my God, it feels like anyone in world cricket could hit him for 4 today, right? Batting is different because we don't have the run in and we don't have the impact of the ball. You know, we don't see the wicketkeeper taking it. Do you know what I mean? We don't see all those sorts of parts for batting. But when you look at it, it's a very similar thing. There are some days when a batter just comes out and everything comes off the middle of the bat, and they can't tell you why. And then the next day they go out, they try and do the exact same thing, and it doesn't work. And we know that this is a big issue for batters psychologically. You know, you have the oh my God, I was going to say Benkenstein. It's not Benkenstein. Neil Mackenzie in South Africa with, you know, taping the bats to his roof, right? Why is he doing that? He's doing that in part because of mental health issues. He's doing that in part because batters believe in luck, but he's also doing that in part because he doesn't know how to make himself good on every single day the way that he feels like he should be, right? John Wright gluing his glove to the bat, right? You know, all of these sorts of stories they don't always know how to fix the thing that is wrong with them. And they also then, as you said before, don't know why they are good on the other days. They just know there is a difference, right? And we all know this instinctively, right? Like, you know, there's some really great writers who I could see sometimes like they've thrown everything they can at this piece and they're really excited to have written it. But they weren't, I could tell they just weren't on a good writing day, right? Like I can read it and tell you straight away of just like, they've overcomplicated this, they've, you know, whatever. And then another day, it just all flows absolutely perfectly, right? And so this is a normal part of it. But there are people who are at a really high sort of intellectual level, right? Who can look at their game and just be like, oh, okay, what I did on this day was this, so I just need to do this. And when I say intellectual level, I don't mean that they're particularly smarter than anyone else, because as I said, Stuart Broad's quite smart. There are lots of bowlers who aren't as smart as Stuart Broad who can't do that. I remember talking to one bowler, and he would say to me, he would just feel sometimes that his shoulders weren't right, and he would like sort of just shake it off, and the next 2 balls he would bowl, he would make sure that all he thought about was his shoulders. And once he got back into that rhythm, he was fine. And there's that great moment in World Series cricket where Dennis Lillee comes off the ground, goes out the back of Waverley. I think it was Waverley. Goes out the back of Waverley, goes into the truck and looks at himself and goes, "Can you just show me myself bowling for 2 seconds?" And he goes, "Got it." Goes back out and is great again, right? Dennis Lillee had that. That's why he was such a great fast bowling coach, right? Dennis Lillee had that ability to be like, "Oh, this is out of alignment. Great, I'm going to be going off." And you get other batters and bowlers who can look at themselves for hours on end and not see it. They can tell you that it's wrong, but they don't know how to get it to the other level. And I think that Babar probably goes there.
Yeah, you gave the Sachin Tendulkar example as well, right? If there's a slight change in the angle of his elbow, he will pick it up. But Babar might be one of those people who is clueless both in success and failure. And
so there was the Sachin one. That's a really fascinating one because someone put a comment in when they were slagging off Babar when we made the video, and I think it was on Twitter or something. They tagged me in it, and they said, "Oh, you know, great batters change their position on the crease, ball by ball, and they, you know, do different styles for different players and all this sort of stuff." And I was like, "No, they don't." And I can tell you why, because I talked to Rahul Dravid about this. And Rahul Dravid said that one of Sachin's big skills was in the middle of an innings, he would suddenly take an off-stump guard, right? And he would nail the off-stump guard. And Rahul fucking Dravid's at the other end going, how could he do that? How could he just bat on off-stump if he hasn't been practicing batting on off-stump for 3 weeks in the nets, right? And so we think, because we've heard a few, and they're, you know, Javed Miandad and Sachin Tendulkar and George Headley, those guys, they could have batted, Sunil Gavaskar could bat left-handed in a first-class game. right? Without practicing it and just nail it, right? Whereas other players, any small change that they have to make, they're off balance. They can't do it anymore. They need months and months of practice sometimes. And so Babar is one of those players who I think if he can't change from an innings to innings position, and I think that doesn't mean he's not great, because we know what he can do when it works, but it does mean that he can't flow between different states. And there are batters who just cannot do, and there are, as I said, if Rahul Dravid is saying it, there are great batters who can't do that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, Daniel Rasool from ESPN Cricket Info, him and I were having a chat about this, and he had a theory that Babar, obviously has immense talent, which led him to, be so prolific in international cricket. ODI cricket he's been a master at, and in Test cricket he had that period. Now, every great batter does go through a period in their career where, they've hit a slump and they need to reinvent themselves. Yep. And that's kind of where Babar is stuck right now. The reinvention period is taking far longer than, other great batters, I suppose. And he will have to reinvent himself in order to prove to the world, I suppose, that he is of that ilk. And this kind of goes in line with the whole notion that Babar might be clueless in both success and failure, and that Babar might be a rhythm batter. So I think it all checks out.
I want to compare this to my writing a little bit, because I mentioned writing before as well. So I have this incredible run from 2007 to 2014 where I basically go from unknown, knowing no one in cricket, right? Other than having played, 3 or 4 games with Ed Joyce once, like I knew no one. I go from unknown to the senior writer on Cricket Info, right? In 7 years. Literally writing in my underwear for my friends to, traveling around the world with Cricket Info. And I started to have this panic attack, because when I wrote a bad piece, I could tell it was a bad piece. Like Babar can tell you that his footwork is wrong, that the innings hasn't gone correctly. He can look at it and go, look, my balance is off here, blah, blah, blah. But I couldn't tell you why it had happened. And so I spent the next, I think it was about 18 months, deconstructing everything I'd ever done, from the Cricket World Balls Day through to all the ESPN stuff, the feature stuff, the news stuff, whatever I had to write, I deconstructed it all, because I was terrified, Behram, that I would one day just go into a slump with my writing and never be able to work out what that was. But it took me a long time to be able to work out what it was that I did and everything else. It's where my writing course comes from. Like I talk about it in the writing course. The writing course comes from that period. That is the hardest thing in the world. So I have one tip for most writers, right? And I give it to young writers and they don't do it, right? And the tip is that when you've written something, read it out loud afterwards. Yeah. Right? And Cheyenne, who works with us, he's going to be pissed that I've mentioned this, but fuck him. He still struggles with that, because I tell you what, you'll never get a better mirror for your writing than reading it out loud and being like, oh, this is dreadful. I've got to fix all this. I've got to make this better. And not all players have the ability to go back and look at themselves, because it's like, the first time you broadcast, you probably heard your voice and went, is that what I sound like? Really? Like, I thought I spoke much clearer than that. I thought my voice was less annoying. I thought it was deeper. I thought it was brighter. I thought it was whatever, right? And then you hear yourself and you're like, oh my God, that's actually who I am. And it's that mirror that a lot of international players really, really struggle with, right? And to go back to, it was Daniel that you said, you go back to his point, right? When you are mega talented, right? And I'm not comparing my writing to Babar Azam's batting. When you are mega talented and you zip through based on talent alone, you don't have to learn anything. Yeah. Right? So many test players will tell you the first time they really start to learn about their career is when they're on the verge of being dropped. And at that stage, you're like, oh my God, okay, how does this work? How am I preparing correctly? Or why am I doing this? And why do I do that? And shouldn't I be trying this and all this sort of stuff, right? That's when you start to learn all this sort of stuff. And when you are Babar Azam's level, he's never on the verge of being dropped. He would need to do another year and a half of averaging 20 for Pakistan to even have the conversation about him being dropped, right? And so I think it is sometimes harder for those kinds of players to learn than it is. I always thought that if Michael Clark was dropped, so he was supposed to be dropped in, which series was it? 2006-07. He's supposed to be dropped in 2006-07. Watson gets injured and Michael Clark comes back in, makes a bunch of runs, batting down the order against a broken England side, right? The best thing for Michael Clark would have been to be dropped for a year and for him to go on. Because when Michael Clark really starts to think about batting, look at the last 4, before his back goes, look at that 4 or 5 year period where he was a genius. But up until that point, he'd been coasting on his talent. And even though he was dropped from the side, he wasn't really out of the side because he came straight back in.
Yeah.
He didn't have time to go off and take stock and go, do you know what? I need to do this. And it really takes him a long time to ever get to that point where he matches his natural talent with hard work and thought. And when he does that, he makes triple centuries and double centuries. He makes that incredible 100 with a broken arm against Morne Morkel and all these sorts of things. But by that stage, he didn't have the impact of the player he should have because he never had to rebuild his game and think about the level that he should have earlier in his career.
Yeah. All right. So almost 50 minutes into this podcast, let's get to the fun stuff. Now, since the start of Babar's ongoing slump, I've been confused personally as to whether he's going through a mental block or he has developed a technical issue. I was voicing all of these concerns in real time with all of you guys at Good Areas when I was in the press box watching Babar fall over. His feet are going nowhere and he's losing balance and he's looking really ugly. Because, at the start of that slump, if you think of, last year, Babar, for the short periods that he was occupying the crease for, was looking really good out there. But in recent times, it's been a struggle in three quarters. He's looked like a shadow of his former self, the batter that the world was coming to recognize. And it's been quite evident that, he's lost something over here. And yeah, I was convinced after this recent test series versus Bangladesh that it's not just a mental thing at this point. It has to be technical.
Yeah.
That's where you come in, right? And that's where you kind of crack the toe. So I need to kind of...
Crack the toe.
Yeah, you have to walk us through all of this because, there is this theory that a lot of what might be going wrong with Babar could revolve around the toe. You've seen footage, of course, from his stance from 2017, 2019, and then 2024. And his toe used to point towards, somewhat the non-striker's end, right? Maybe you could say mid-off. And in recent times...
Mid-on.
Mid-on, sorry. And in recent times, that toe is basically, or that entire foot, the front foot, is parallel to the popping crease. So it's pointing towards point or cover or somewhere there and thereabouts. So his open stance, or his stance which was once open, is now closed. In your words, he's batting one-eyed now as opposed to two-eyed. So how did you kind of figure this out? Talk to me about the revelation and what its implications are.
So because I do believe he's a cluster batter, and because I do believe he's a rhythm batter, and those are kind of linked to each other as well, I kind of just figure he would eventually work it out and he would make a bunch of runs and we'd never talk about, and we'd just be like, remember that time Babar stopped making runs? That was weird, right? And I think it had got to the point, and I remember during the 2023 World Cup when it was clear that he wasn't batting at the level that we expected him to bat.
Yep.
I remember thinking, it's not that big a sample size. We'll give it a bit longer, blah, blah, blah. And then it goes on. And then I'm watching him play Bangladesh and I'm sitting there going, this is not the Babar Azam I'm used to.
The guy who's inside edging a cover drive and chopping it onto the stumps.
Yeah.
And, feet are miles apart from the bat. Versus Shakib, he literally fell over. Like, these are just things that you don't associate to Babar Azam.
Exactly. And especially, I think for me, it's the balance. So I think it was the chop on was one of the big ones where I was just like, his balance is like, there's no reason for someone as technically correct as him to ever be massively out of balance. Like, you look at someone like Ricky Ponting who took that humongous stride forward, right? You're like, he's going to be out of balance sometimes because of that stride. Like, whereas you look at Kane Williamson and you're like, well, he should never be out of balance, because he doesn't need that sort of movement. So I watched some of those. I watched him bat a little bit in that test series at times, and I was like, okay, there's something wrong. You guys were all going to make the piece, and you were looking at different things. And I'm quite lucky that we have this partnership with MV Play now. And so MV Play basically records pretty much all the international balls, and they chop them up so you can watch them in individual things. And I don't think they had all the... also, he hadn't faced a lot of balls in the test. I don't know if they had all the tests. And so I was like, I just want to watch like 200 balls of his in one period in a row. And I know that sounds like a lot, but on MV Play, that's probably like 25, 30 minutes, right? It may actually probably even less than that, but I will replay some of them and look at them over and over again. And so I go and I have a look at all of this year's PSL. And so I'm looking at it I see a couple of little patterns and whatever. And then I was like, okay, so now I have that and I understand what he's doing now. So now what I have to do is compare that to peak Babar Azam. So I go back and I picked 100 that I remembered off the top of my head. And I remember everyone in Australia going nuts about this 100. I think, was it at Adelaide Oval?
Yeah.
Is it an ODI at Adelaide Oval?
The ODI. Yeah, I think you're right. Can't quite recall.
Yeah.
He does have a test 100 in Australia randomly as well.
Yeah, it wasn't the test 100 I looked at. I looked at the ODI. And I went back and then, first I was just like, there's something wrong. There's something different here. And I couldn't work out what it was. And then I start freeze framing, right? So I freeze frame as the bowler's about to deliver. I freeze frame as the bowler is delivering. And then I freeze frame about when the ball's about. So I try and freeze frame when the ball's about 2 meters down. Because, as we probably talked about this before. Scientifically, top batters like Babar Azam only watch the ball for 2 or 3 meters.
Yeah.
Then they move their eyes to where the ball is. So I want to know what his movement is when he's watching the ball, right? After that, it's just reflexes and catching up with the ball and everything else. But I want to have a look at that. And then the next thing I do is I put them side by side. So all 3 of them. And at first I was like, oh, he's a little bit more crouched, which I think is what you noticed when I showed it to you. He's a little bit more crouched. It's like, it's not a lot, and then I got really fascinated with his back lift because I thought it was his back lift that had changed. And then and when I did frame by frame, I was like, no, his back lift's in the exact same spot. It's still coming up at that right hip. It's quite a nice back lift. I'm like, okay, it's not that. And then suddenly, probably working all the way down from the head and whether his head was over and everything to the back lift. The next thing is the feet. And then I look at the feet and I was like, oh, wow. And when I sent it through to you, it's not like if I hadn't have told you guys what it was, I'm not sure. And you are all cricket experts who work with us, right? I'm not sure you guys would have picked it up. But it just happened to be that I was drawn to that. And suddenly I realized that in that innings, and he's facing Josh Hazelwood, I can't remember who else is playing. His feet are almost pointing to mid-on, right? As we said before. Certainly between the non-striker and mid-on. And the innings in the PSL, he is going pretty much to the non-striker directly, or even sometimes almost the stumps, right? That's a big, big change. And as you said before, it's the best way of explaining it is when you're side on, you're sort of looking across yourself. And when you're open and your stance is open, and so your leg is towards the leg stump, you're suddenly looking with both your eyes looking down. Now, there are many great batting coaches who will tell you side on is better than front on. But we've obviously seen some great front on players. The issue isn't whether it's technically correct in either direction. The issue is what works best for you.
Yeah,
right?
And his balance is clearly out, in that period where his toe is parallel to the popping crease.
Yeah.
And
so
your
then
theory...
So once I get to that, but then that only tells me about seam. And I knew, because you guys were already talking about it, that he had a problem with spin.
Yeah.
So then you go to spin. And the one with spin's even more fascinating because he's got this trigger movement where against left arm finger spin, his foot goes to off stump. So he's starting closed and then he's going further across himself, which means he's playing around his pad. Again, when he's in maximum form, right? I'm like, okay, he's probably good enough to do that. But even Steve Smith struggles when the ball's spinning away from him because he plays around his pads. But Steve Smith plays sort of across his pads. Whereas what Babar is doing is playing around his pad, which means that if one small movement goes wrong, and he's completely lost his balance. His head is on the wrong side, and he's now trying to hit a ball that is inside his eye line. So if anyone in this listening to this podcast has ever played cricket, it's very easy to hit the ball when it's bowled at middle stump and off stump, right?
Yeah.
Because that is directly under your eyes most of the time. Once it's outside off stump, you start to struggle. That's where you play and miss the most, right? And now think about what's happened when it's on leg stump or down leg side. Most average players miss the ball. Right, even great players generally, have a look at how many guys in T20 cricket are just desperate to get a tickle on the ball and they miss, and it's because it's inside their eye line at that point, and it's the hardest ball to hit is the one down the leg side, right?
Yeah,
he's trying to do that when a bowler is bowling on middle stump and spinning it back onto off stump. So he's upping the level of difficulty over and over again. And the other thing I noticed was when I went through all those PSL balls again, and he faced tons of left arm finger spin. I was really lucky. When he was actually batting quite well, his foot wasn't doing that as much. Or he had an open foot. So even when it moved across, it wasn't moving in front of the off stump. right? It was moving towards middle stump. And when he did that, he looked like a great player of spin. And then the next ball, literally the next ball, his trigger movement gets wrong and he goes across it and he's trying to play outside the line of the ball again. And he looks like you or me.
Yeah.
And it wasn't like he was getting out to all these balls, but I was watching him face Imad Wasim and there was there was some trash left arm finger spin, part-time stuff he was facing where he couldn't punish it because he'd completely lost his balance and he was getting an inside edge or, all these sorts of things. And that is, that sort of level of analysis isn't really available without, I used to do it with Cricinfo and it would take me like 3 or 4 days, but with MV Play, I can do this all instantly. So there is absolutely no doubt that he has changed his stance and that some of his trigger movements are slightly different. And then you get to why he's done that. My guess is he was nicking off quite a bit against right arm seam. And so he's like, okay, so what I need to do is make sure that my left foot is closer to the pitch of the ball. And if my left foot's closer to the pitch of the ball, that will drag my head over the ball and I won't be edging off. So it's not like he's done it for no reason. He's probably done it for that exact reason. And there's a video that has surfaced. So a lot of people have sent it to me afterwards of Nasser Hussain explaining why Babar Azam is now doing that, but doing it in a positive way of going, look, he used to nick off a lot. Now he's more towards off stump and he doesn't nick off as much. Right. And that's from like 2020. When were they in England playing test matches? Around that period.
Was COVID series 2020.
Yeah. So in 2020, Nasser Hussain has picked up that he has changed at that point, but he continues to make runs. Right. So the difference is by 2022, those runs are gone.
If you make any content, Minvo Pro is the tool for you. Take your long format content and cut it and slice it for social media. This AI-inspired weapon will turn your one piece of work into so many clips. Try Minvo.pro now.
Yeah. And all of this stuff checks out. Like if you have doubts, we have the numbers to prove it. As far as facing left arm spin is concerned, because he has struggled versus that. If you look at his golden period, right, he has gotten out to that kind of bowling type around 8 times, but he's averaging 77 runs per dismissal versus that bowling type. Now, since the start of 2023, he's faced slow left armers 6 times in Test cricket, and in 4 of those innings, he's gotten out to them. He's averaging 14.5. So it's basically the KP disease, but much worse. And also, you explained the Nasser Hussain thing of how, he's not nicking as much to, the keeper or the slip cordon. Well, if you look at his golden period from 2018 to 2022, he was out nicking, to the keeper and the slip cordon around 21 times. And now he's getting out LBW and bowled a lot more than he ever was before. So again, the stance kind of, comes into play over here. So it's great that we can actually prove the toe theory with all of these numbers, because otherwise it's very easy to call it all fluff. And it might even be like not the main reason why he's not scoring runs. It's not like we're saying that this is the reason and this is the gospel truth, but it does kind of make sense, no?
Yeah, and I think, so what I went looking for, I was a bit shocked that I found it, right? Because it felt quite obvious. But
and
also,
cheers to MV Play for that. We couldn't have done it without you.
But I think this is where it gets much more complicated, because there are all these people going, oh, why doesn't he know this, blah, blah, blah. And I said, he knows this, right? Because he made a conscious decision. There's no doubt it's a conscious decision. For 2 years, he continued making runs at Babar Azam level.
Yeah.
So with everything I have pointed out, for 2 years he batted his traditional way and made a ton of runs. And then for 2 years he batted this way and kept making a ton of runs. The issue now is that method seems to have affected his balance. And so Himanesh sent me a message about this. And he said, are you saying that 2-eyed stance is better than 1-eyed stance? And I was like, no. I'm saying that for Babar Azam, at the moment, his balance isn't very good because he's got not incorrect is wrong. He's got a style that doesn't suit him just as well, right? And when he's gone through this dip, it's been exacerbated by the fact that he's batting with something that isn't natural to him. It is natural for him to have his middle foot on his middle foot. How many feet does this man have? his back foot on middle stump and his front foot on leg stump. That's his natural position, right? Well, now what he's doing is he's got his middle foot on middle stump. I keep saying middle foot. He's got his back foot on middle stump and his front foot on middle stump, right? And that is affecting his balance and the way he naturally goes about batting. That goes back to the rhythm thing we were talking about before.
Yeah.
When he was batting really good, I think if he batted like George Bailey, right? Remember when George Bailey had his back foot on leg stump and his front foot on off stump, right? If he batted like George Bailey in his peak, I think Babar Azam would still have made runs. But I think that when you stop making runs, and over a long period of time is now come, I think you're better off to go back to your natural position and let your natural instincts take over a little bit, get your form back, and then you can start to do little tweaks if you want. Because he's still going to, let's say he still has that issue with nicking off, right?
Yeah.
So I'm not a batting coach. Like, I don't want to pretend to, and he's worked with some great batting coaches. Like he worked with Trent Woodhill at one stage and, some other really high quality batters. I'm not slaying off any of his batting coaches, but if I was his batting coach now, I would say, I think this is more natural for you to have yourself more open up. But if you're worried about that nicking just outside off stump, start with your back foot on off stump and your front foot on middle stump. So you've still got that openness. You've still got the same balance that you feel really comfortable with, but you're also covering off stump a little bit more.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that for someone like Babar Azam might be the middle ground between those two things. But in the short term, I wouldn't tell him that. In the short term, I'd be like, let's go back to how you were when you were great. Right. And how you got great. Once we understand that, we maybe understand that the thing of unlocking your balance. And then once we've unlocked your balance, you've been doing that for 6 months and you feel really good, let's go in the nets and see what else we can do.
Yeah, and with respect to balance, there are other metrics which can kind of, feed to this notion, and they are those of control percentage and fall shot percentage. Because if you look at Babar's career in those three phases again, the early poor phase, his fall shot percentage per dismissal isn't high. It's 6.3, whereas the global average is 10. So he's not, playing as many fall shots, and his control percentages are high. So you could say that he could have even been unlucky in that period. Of course, the control percentage goes up in the golden period from 2018 to 2022, and the fall shot percentage goes about to 10, which makes sense because he's batting for longer. But in this recent slump, the fall shot percentage per dismissal has increased, and the control percentages have gone down, which directly correlate to the balance. And also, I'm calling you Babar now, and also Jarrod. If you look at his ODI cricket, we all kind of agree that he walked into ODI cricket as somewhat of a legend, right? And he was averaging 60 in the format till not too long ago. If you look at his ODI numbers from the start of 2023, he's averaging 46, striking at 84. And while those numbers are pretty good for any other batter, they're not Babar Azam. That's not him. So all of this stuff kind of fits together.
Yeah, and I think for me, if he was still making runs in one-day cricket at the same level, I would have been less interested. But I knew he had dipped in ODI cricket, which to me then goes to technical, right? That's just the way I look at these things. If you're struggling in that way, I suddenly think that must be a technical issue, and there is an issue there. So yeah, I think all those things are playing a part. He hasn't had. I think that one issue for cricketers these days is you can't just go back and play first-class cricket anymore, right? And I know we've already talked about him not playing a lot, but if you think about, I'm trying to think about someone who had a similar sort of run, and they can just go back and they can play first-class cricket for a little while, like Dennis Compton. You talked about Dennis Compton before. Dennis Compton's playing so much cricket that when he goes back, he's playing first-class cricket. He can get it. No one's watching. He can get himself back into form and then come back and work on things. Babar Azam, every single move he makes is watched, right? And we know that. You and I have documented that before. We got hate mail for documenting that.
Yep.
He's not a normal player, right? He's not Marnus Labuschagne. Yep. Marnus Labuschagne's form dip, it's got some press. People haven't talked about it that much. Right? And his form dip has been longer and, maybe not quite as dramatic, but it's been longer and it's been, there are elements of, was he lucky? Should he have been caught more early on in his career and all this sort of stuff? And can he actually play away from home? And all these different questions about Marnus Labuschagne, despite the fact we saw Marnus Labuschagne go up against some of the best Jofra Archer spells we've seen in modern cricket, right?
Fair.
Or some of the best spells we've seen in modern cricket from Jofra Archer, I should say. And Marnus is third tier star, right? that David Warner and Steve Smith were there. He's always going to be the third there. Babar Azam is literally the greatest batter that Pakistan have in this era.
Yep.
He is the captain. He's the face of the team. He's the face of them losing. He's occasionally the face of them winning. And it's a completely different level. And he can't just go off and fix this in the same way. Now, you can do it in the nets and everything else. I'm not saying that he didn't have options for it, but it's not the same as it has been in the past for players when a player can just go off and do stuff. Like Babar Azam is like, oh no, now I've got this franchise league, and now I've got this franchise. What's he playing at the moment? What's the league of cricket he's playing in the moment?
He's not playing high-level franchise leagues, right? LPL and
no, but what was he playing the other day? Who was he playing for the other day?
Oh, that's the Champions Cup. It's a domestic competition which has been staged by Pakistan's PCB. Oh, the PCB's chairman / the Interior Minister of Pakistan. Yeah.
So those games were quite highly watched, from what I could tell. Yeah.
Yes.
Right? Like a lot of people seem to be watching them by the amount of people who've sent me clips of this game. In the old days, he would have gone back and he would have played List A cricket. Let's say there was another List A competition. Probably would have been first class. And he would have just been in the lab. He could be as ugly as he wanted. He could change his technique from ball to ball. He could do all this sort of stuff. Babar is being watched in some tournament that no one knew existed a month ago.
Well, it didn't exist a month ago. This is literally the new chairman's brainchild.
Like it's literally, bang, out of nowhere, we have this tournament. So he can't go off to the nets. He's not playing first class. Do you know what I mean? It's not the same situation. There's always another thing that he has to play in, right? There's always, and so modern cricket probably favors batters who can self-diagnose on the run, right?
That's true.
And the other thing I would say with Babar Azam is that we saw a whole host of sort of the, Gary Palmer, Graham Ford, Trent Woodhill type coaches coming through who would coach batters outside of their international and their franchise stuff. So essentially, we're getting to a point in cricket where players have private coaches that they hire to fix things. I don't know, and you might know more about this than I do, but I think that's what Babar Azam needs, because he needs a coach who knows him inside and out, who he can take with him anywhere around the world, who can send video clips from at any stage, and they can just have a discussion. And there are lots of players who do this with their personal coaches, nothing to do with their international team or their domestic team. That is, but that's a new thing in cricket, and not everyone likes it, and not everyone has that. Not everyone wants to spend the money. Like, I'm not being a dick or anything. That's money out of your pocket. Yeah. That's not going to your family, that money, right? That's not going to your lifestyle. But it is something that I know people like Alistair Cook and, these other players really like.
Shan Masood's done that.
Shan Masood was Gary Palmer as well. I think Shan Masood was with the same guy that Alistair Cook was with. But Trent Woodhill has done it with a bunch of different players, right? And there's heaps of them. I'm just going with the famous ones off the top of my head. I think Graham Ford. Is it Graham Ford? The South African
The Sri Lankan coach?
Yeah, so he's done it with a few guys, I think, as well. And, a lot of my friends who are coaches, they have like a couple of clients that's what they do. And we're not talking about masses of money, but you might pay them, 5 figures a year to be available whenever you need them. And then they might zip you into a tour because it's like, batting coach here is really good, but I need to work with you because you're my batting coach.
So, of course, Jarrod, you're not a batting coach, but I have one more question with respect to the toe, right? Because this was not adding up in my brain. Babar Azam has started to struggle big time versus right arm pace. This is something that Cheyenne found, I think. And he was averaging 48.6 against it in his peak years per dismissal, which is a lot of runs. And he was playing in England, Australia, South Africa, the West Indies, all of these destinations or venues where seamers generally tend to do well. And since the start of 2023, he's averaging 18.3 runs per dismissal versus right arm pace and has been dismissed 7 times by that bowling type. This is crazy to me because, of course, Babar was dominating the wobble seam, delivery in the pace playing pandemic. And also he was, averaging well over 50 versus good length deliveries in that period. And now he's struggling big time versus that length as well. So is this also perhaps related to the toe, or is this something else?
No, I would say it's related. I would assume that he moved over to off stump because right arm bowlers, I think they stopped bowling not that they stopped bowling the wobble ball, but the conventional wobble ball is full at the top of off stump. So you're trying to hit, if the ball goes dead straight, it should hit the top of off stump. If it seams back, it should hit the top of leg stump. And if it straightens, it should go away, and you got a chance of getting an edge. That's why the wobble ball is so brilliant, right? Because it's the three options available to you at all times, and you've got LBW and bold in play, and you've got caught behind and caught and slips in play. That's why it's a friggin' nightmare, and that's why it ruins so many batters. If you look at what they were doing to Babar, they actually go away from the conventional lines and lengths, and they start bowling wider to him. Partly because of his technique and where his front foot is my guess, right? They're like, well, if we bowl wider, his front foot has to move all the way over, which is going to slow him down. He's going to reach for balls. Hopefully his hands will be away from his eye line, and then we'll be able to nick him off. So he then changes his technique to do that, which then opens him back up to the wobble ball, because at that stage, he's more in front of his stumps, which means they can attack the stumps more and they can get LBWs and bolds more. So this is the thing look, we're at a level now in cricket where we can see this happening, right? This happened to Greg Chappell. This happened to Viv Richards. This happened to Don Bradman, right? But it might happen over a course of a series, and then the next series you turn up in 3 years' time and that batter's completely changed again, and you haven't played them for 2 years, and it doesn't matter. We now have the ability for, MV Play is just one company. There's other companies, but obviously we're going to keep pumping them up because they helped us with this and everything else. But those companies, you just go to your phone, if you're Jimmy Anderson, and you can look at the last 100 balls that Babar Azam has played. Yeah. Right? You can even, like on MV Play, I didn't do this for Bubba because I wanted to see everything, but you can look at just the balls he's uncomfortable against. You can see just the balls that he's hit boundaries against. You can watch just the balls that he's edged on the outside of his bat, right? So you can do all that sort of stuff, which means that there's this constant movement. So do you remember Daryl Mitchell? So I talked about him before. Daryl Mitchell, massive dude, big front step. What starts to happen with Daryl Mitchell? The wicket keepers come up to the stumps.
Yeah, that's true.
Right? It's as
a
simple
lot of people
as
have done that versus him.
Yeah. Wicket keeper comes up to the stumps and suddenly we're in a completely different world, right? And that is, so now Daryl Mitchell has to change. He can't do the little shuffle step to get outside the line and down the wicket, right? He can't get to the wobble ball at the same level that he used to. Now, I haven't had a look at what Daryl Mitchell's been averaging, since that time. But what I do know is that Daryl Mitchell has to change his technique. And what modern test players are in is a constant evolutionary battle, right? A constant evolutionary battle where at all stages they are looking at going, and I'm just looking at Daryl Mitchell's numbers now. So Daryl Mitchell, 2021, 2022, he averages in the 60s in test cricket. In the 11 test matches he's played since then, it's just under 40. Right? So now we know how good Daryl Mitchell is. We know how smart Daryl Mitchell is. What's his next move?
That's true.
What does he do now to get back on top? And maybe he doesn't. Maybe he just becomes a 40 average player from then on in, and that's a really good player, especially I mean, that's a good international player at the moment, and his average will look better. His average will look like it's probably 45 when actually he's now a 40 average player because he was averaging 50 for a while. Or 50, even 55 for a while, right?
Yeah. Maybe he evolves, maybe he plateaus, or maybe he regresses. We don't know that yet.
And maybe he changes his batting and he goes back to in the crease, right? Yeah. And that actually unlocks something else for him, right?
That's true.
But that is what test players are now doing, and what we are seeing with Babar is not a one-off. It's just a normal part of test cricket at the moment.
Yeah. Speaking of evolution, I don't know if you've seen a lot of footage of Babar from the Champions Cup, but, after we had published the piece and the video and everything, tried my best to get the analysis to Babar. I don't know if it reached him or not, but then you have heard that he might have, been made privy to it. We don't know exactly if someone told him.
I should say, we don't know if he saw the video or whether he was just told about the concept.
Exactly. We're not sure if he read the piece, saw the video, or was just told by someone that, hey, Babar, this thing has come up. But we have a bit of a confirmation, even by looking at the footage, that he might have looked at that or have had a chat with someone, because in that recent knock, and by the way, when this video was being recorded, he's just played that one knock of 45 since, so he might have played more knocks by the time this is released. There seemed to be an adjustment of the toe. It was kind of pointing straighter towards the non-strikers end once again, which of course brought a great sense of pride to me personally and was an alien feeling. But that's not what this is about. What I'm asking you is that we always hear that Babar is very, very rigid, is not open to a lot of conversation. He's not very, he's very hesitant to change, and he does his own thing. He doesn't listen to people. Well, he adjusted the toe, right? And I mean, imagine a world in which he goes on another run scoring spree, and then you probably start to get worshipped over here in Pakistan, Jarrod.
I haven't been worshipped in Pakistan for a long time, so I feel like I'm due. Look, we did it. We talked about this on whichever podcast we did the other day, and look, I certainly understand. This is not the first time I've been involved in stuff like this, and I'll try to sum it up a little bit more succinctly than I did the other day, but I kind of feel like if it's available in the universe, right? Like this knowledge was available in the universe. I wasn't the only person who had access to this.
Yeah.
That there's a very big chance that he worked this out for the same reason. That him or his people were looking it up at the same time that I was looking it up. Because it had got to a point where we could no longer ignore it. Right. And maybe it would have been, maybe the analyst or a batting coach or, a friend of his or, a senior player, whatever, had been telling him the same thing. And then when it was shown, in the way that we were able to illustrate it, that helped, right? Yeah. But it's also possible that he just worked this out on his own, and it's a complete coincidence that it's happened at the same time. But to me, I suppose what I was trying to say on that other podcast is, it doesn't matter to me whether someone sent Babar the video and he sat there watching it and was like, oh, okay, I should do that again now. Or if he just decided on his own, do you know what? Clearly, against Bangladesh, this wasn't working. I'm just going to go back to the old style, because it still validates the work that we did.
Yeah.
Right?
Also, no one else had done that work prior. So that's the biggest sense of pride for me personally, that we were, faster to it than anyone else.
And look, I am aware of, sometimes I will do something and a player will instantly get a lot better, and I'll get all this credit for being involved in it because I've pointed out some technical things and whatever. And like, even when I look back, I'm like, did they actually listen to my stuff, or have they done something different again, right? Or is it just a bad bowling lineup, right? Or they got dropped twice, and so they made runs that day. And so the way I look at it is, it's just nice to do the work, and it's nice that we found something that someone else, that certainly wasn't being talked about all that much at that point.
Wasn't being documented, at least,
Yeah.
Even if someone had picked up on it.
But for me, the thrill is, I wrote this piece years ago for the Night Watchman, where I was, when I was a young kid, I was at the MCG watching a Shield game, Victoria, New South Wales, one of the best hundreds I've ever seen from Matthew Elliott in that game, by the way. And in that game, I saw, I was sitting there on my own, and some older guy with a suit sort of comes up behind me, and Corey Richards was batting and says, what do you think of Corey Richards? And I think there was just no one around, so he sort of just said it out loud, and I sort of said, I don't know, he doesn't get his foot to the ball. I kind of feel like you could nick him off just by bowling wide consistently to him or whatever. And then I turn around and it's Trevor Holmes, right? And I remember I had this, fantasy life of like, and I was always quite good at that sort of stuff. And I had this kind of fantasy thing of like Trevor Holmes going, wow, who are you, young man? You should come and work for us. But this is like 97, maybe 98. I can't remember when Elliott made that 100. But it was Stuart Clark was bowling, so I think it was probably around that period. And then years later, I was sitting on the bench in, for Hong Kong. So Hong Kong was the first team that let me sit on the bench as a writer. And I remember the coach, Simon Cook, turned to me at one stage and started asking my opinion on stuff. And I was like, I'm just here as a journalist. And he's like, yeah, but you're here and we need to win this game. What do you think about? And I was like, okay. And you just, the rush of that, right?
Yeah.
You go through, and I had Rahul Dravid talking about one of my pieces on Cricket Info on the broadcast, and saying that, what I had said made sense at that stage. And you're just sitting there going, oh my God, like, you start to get those sorts of moments, and you've had your first moment of this, of knowing what it is like to be on. And it never stops being magical. And I tell you why, because we're not ever great cricketers, right?
Of course not.
Like we couldn't impact the game on that level. Like I can play in a game with professionals where they're like, he's like not shit, but they also know I'm not a professional. Like there's no stage where they go, oh, Jarrod, he probably could. No, they never think that. They're like, yeah, if we're playing in a game with a bunch of amateurs, Jarrod might be one of the better amateurs. That's the best I'll ever get from a professional, right?
Yeah.
And so through this work, to see what you do play out on the field, it's so bizarre. And, you talk to anyone who's ever been an analyst, and because most analysts are not players, right? They all feel that same thing of that first time when you say something. And for me, I've probably never been in that sort of Nathan Lehman, Jimenez, Freddie Wild situation where you're doing it on a daily basis. And, so I do it for a month and then it disappears, right? But even when I go back to do it and I'm like, okay, we should open this person and he should bowl this to this guy. And then they do it and we get him out. Like I'm I'm playing it cool within the dugout and everything. And I might say to someone, well, that was the plan. We nailed that one. That's the most I'll ever give it, right? Because it's the players who do the work and it's the players who put their bodies on the line and everything else.
Of course.
But from our perspective, you have to understand how cool it is. So I didn't watch the 45 or the 75 or the 2 knocks that he made. But others obviously have, and they've made a connection. And I went back and had a look at it, of course, to have a look at it afterwards. But I wasn't watching the Champions Cup live. You'd be shocked to know, Behram. Although I do watch some random cricket, so it was always a chance. And you watch that, and you get the little buzz again. And as I said, we may have had nothing to do with it, which is absolutely more than fine as well. But from our point of view, it's like we did the work. There were 4 of us working on this piece. It was for us, it was a very, very overly researched piece. And to come out on the other side and see him move his toes, it's like, great, nailed that one. Now the next 5 ones that we get wrong, it's a bit like, we've made our 100, so we can fail for a couple of games in a row here before anyone comes knocking on our door.
Absolutely. And I had never gone through anything like this before. And I've been, creating these videos and writing pieces and working in cricket media for a while now. And obviously you get a high when something does well. But this was a different kind of high. This was so alien. It was so bizarre that, oh my God, something that we did is, playing out on the field. And like Jarrod said, we don't know how he got to that information or whether he just came up with it on his own or whatever. It would be freakish in terms of the timing and coincidence, but still. Just the fact that he's kind of made that correction and he's looked better for those 45 runs than he's looked in a long time. It's been a while since we've said that Babar's looked that good on the crease, right? He smashed Shahnawaz Dahani for 5 fours in a row. And it was amazing to watch that he's made kind of a tweak. And when I was watching that game, I was watching it in passing, right? I wasn't watching it live either. I was like, oh, Babar's scoring runs, nice. Later on, my pal in the PCB, Shafqat Shabir, sends me the footage and he's like, bro, I feel like he's fixed his toe. And I was like, wait a second. This might be real. So it's still giving me goosebumps. It's insane. And just the fact that, we were able to do something in cricket, which might have had an impact is an amazing rush.
Yeah. And it's also worth saying, we're not batting coaches, right?
Yeah.
So, I understand this stuff on a different level than you do, but I'm not a batting coach. Like I've worked with Shan Masood, right? I'm not telling Shan Masood what to do with his pickup. Right, I'm not telling him what to do with his feet. When I'm talking to Shan Masood, and we've done a podcast with Shan on this, and so he's talked about this with me before. Essentially, what I said to him is that from an analyst point of view, if you're coming to England, you have to have a shot that gets you off strike from the channel ball, because if you don't do that, you're just facing 24 straight balls in the channel, and eventually England bowlers will nick you off because that's what they've been doing their whole life. And when he came out the first time, Shan Masood, he was trying to play a back foot cover drive, and it's like. That's like, S tier level shot, mate. You need a C. You need the nudge behind point, or the walking across the line and shoveling it to the leg side. You need that sort of stuff. I'm not a batting coach. I'm not saying this. I told him what shots he needed to be successful based on analysis. He then had to go to his batting coach and say, this is what Jarrod's saying. Does this make sense? How do we get this shot? And then he works it out, right?
Of course.
And he probably, since then he's worked with, Patrick Nguyen and probably other people at CricViz and other analysts and everything else. They would all tell him slightly things. We're not that side of things. But what analysts have, and, me and Cheyenne are probably natural analysts. I think the way that we look at stuff is slightly different ways, but very much natural analysts is, we just see patterns, right? We see them in the numbers. We see them in the cricket. And we put that out into the universe. It's then up to the coaches who do the real work. I'm not throwing balls to Babar in the net, right? I'm not the one saying to him, no, your foot went in front again, right? I'm not doing any of that work. It's up to them to do all that. And then it's the player, right?
Yeah, of course. It is the player, like probably first and foremost, really, because the player is making the adjustment, right?
And what if, how about this? What if he went back to the style that we pointed out and he got worse?
Yeah, that could happen.
No one ever factors that in. Everyone's like, why didn't he change before? And it's like, well, he'd already changed once because he thought he was struggling with one thing. He doesn't want to exacerbate that problem by going back to this other thing. So that's where we are. That's what all of this is. It is not easy for these guys to make a change. It is not a simple thing. And sometimes you have to be in rock bottom to do that. And quite often it needs to be an outsider, right? I'm not saying it was us, but it might have been an outsider from his camp who just said, mate, oh my God, do I have to keep watching this? Clearly your stance is not what it used to be.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because, of course, at the time of this recording, there's only been that one knock of 45. He hasn't really played after that. And we don't know, like, we don't have enough evidence to even say anything that, oh, he's fixed this or whatnot. By the time this comes out, maybe we have more evidence, and with time, we'll figure things out more. But let's suppose he goes on another run scoring spree and the cluster batter theory checks out, then all of us, and I'll be there as well, we'll build Jarrod a statue outside the Gaddafi with our own hands.
No, we've already said it's t-shirts. We're going with t-shirts,
T-shirts with toes on them, big giant toes and Babar's face on them. One last thing we absolutely have to discuss before we end this podcast, and I know it's already a really long one, but it was a really long piece, I suppose.
I think this is worth it for this one.
Yeah. It's the PCB connection, right? And here's where I'll kind of approach this from. A lot of people, casual fans in Pakistan have been going around saying, oh, it's the captaincy that's, undone Babar. It's the pressure that he can't take. And there is an element of, Babar not coming up trumps in big ODI or T20 tournaments. Apart from like 2019 ODI World Cup and 2021 T20 World Cup, he has failed. We're accepting that, right? Yeah. But a lot of people are saying that captaincy is what, ruined him. Now, we can all have our arguments on Babar the captain. We all know he makes tactical blunders. But if you actually look at that golden period, 2018 to 2022, he's captain in, most of it. 2019 to 2022, he is Pakistan's captain for almost, across that entire period, all formats. Of course, Azhar Ali was in test. He was the test captain before. And it's not like Babar captain in test all through the while. But he was scoring all those bulk runs as captain. Here's where it gets interesting, though. The PCB has been extremely volatile. It's been a shit show, even by its own, fragile standards.
A shit show of a clusterfuck.
A shit show of a clusterfuck, absolutely. Since the end of 2022, there have been 4 different people who have held the office of PCB chairman. And due to, the political quagmire that has engulfed the country, every time there is a new leader or there is some sort of shuffle, there is a new PCB chairman, right? And this is all obviously also because the patron-in-chief of the PCB is the Prime Minister of Pakistan, which, with the country in such turmoil, political turmoil, you'd have to say that it kind of makes sense. But there have been so many political appointments with respect to these chairmen, right? And you've also had 7 different people in this period, end of 2022 to now, which have called themselves head coach of the men's team. And there've been like 5 different chief selectors as well. So it's been all over the shop. And one key thing over here is that at least when Rambo was there, sure, he got the pitches wrong. He was a very hands-on man, wanted to do everything himself. But he empowered the team. He empowered Babar. Ever since Rambo left, every other chairman that has come has tried to wrest back that control from the team and Babar to themselves. And it's been like power brokering non-stop. And that coincides, with Babar's slump as well. So it would be hard to convince me otherwise that this has not played a role. And it can't just be the captaincy thing. It's the overall instability.
Yeah, I think, we hear a lot about him being stubborn, right? I'm not saying he's not stubborn. I don't want to. I don't. Because I don't know him particularly well, and it comes from insiders. So I'm going to go with the fact that there's a chance that there's a bit of stubbornness to him.
Of course.
But if you are dealing with several different selectors, and if you were dealing with several different head coaches, and several different assistant coaches, and several different batting coaches, and I'm assuming analysts as well.
Yeah, and the chairman every now and then is saying, "Oh, we'll see after the series whether or not Babar will remain captain for the ODI World Cup."
But then you're right with that. But let's take that captaincy out of it. But just just think about it this way, right? So you're a broadcaster, and you're working for an organization, and the owner changes of that organization. and the editor changes, and the sub-editors change, and the producers change, right? And then 6 months later, and you just keep doing your work. 6 months later, it changes again. And then 3 months later, it changes again. And then a month later, it changes again. And then a year later, it changes again, right? All those people have different visions.
Yeah.
Different ideas, different methods, different ways of going. You're watching that. I could tell you what you would do and anyone listening to this, the vast majority of people listening to this would be like, well, if I'm good at my job, I'm just going to go into a silo and I'm just going to do my job and continue to do my job. And I'm not going to worry. What's that great NFL player?
Tom Brady?
No. There's like a really good journeyman. I remember reading his book once, and he said that at a certain point, there's no point learning people's names because I was traded so often. I think it was an NFL player's book I was reading. I was traded so often that I didn't need to learn anyone's names. Like, it didn't matter to me. It mattered to me. I didn't know who the coaches were, whatever. I knew which office I needed to go to. I knew where to find the footage, and I knew what my number was. And so when someone said my number, I would go out in the field and I would do my role. And that's kind of where Babar Azam is, right? Like that doesn't forgive the form slip, but it does perhaps forgive the fact that he wasn't in the best place to fix it.
Yeah.
Right? That he wasn't in a great space.
It would be hard for any individual to progress in that sort of work environment, for instance, where there's so much chopping and changing and there's not a lot of stability at all.
And also, that's when you become isolated and everything else. Like, I think I made the joke in the video that I could see him in the hotel room with the door under the chair under the handle, not letting anyone in. Right?
I mean,
because he doesn't want to deal with that shit. He doesn't want to hear another fucking coach come to him and tell him, we're gonna bring the team together. He's fucking heard it 7 times.
Yeah.
Right? The team isn't coming together, guys.
There have been leaks, Jarrod, press releases which have been ill-timed, and conversations which have come out to the public, you know?
Leaks are sometimes someone has some information they want to give it out. There have been agenda-based leaks.
Yes.
Right? And that means that, and this goes back to the Babar FC thing that we were talking about before. It's he as a cricketer is a political figure.
Yeah.
Right? And so is Virat Kohli. But the BCCI is a fairly linear organization, right? It's had some issues and had some weird people involved. And, you know, we could do an episode on Jay Shah one day, right?
Yeah.
But if you look at the BCCI as a structure, it's fairly linear. There's nothing linear about PCB. It's over here, it's down here, it's back to front, it's in black and white, it's upside down. We don't know what it's going to be on a day-by-day basis. And
it's
so as
chaos
a professional,
central, basically.
Yeah, and as a professional, that affects you. And so you know, I can certainly see that as being a contributing factor, perhaps not to him losing form, although maybe, but perhaps not to him losing form, but maybe the fact that he didn't instantly rectify it. True. Right? Because he would have so many different people talking to him about so many different things of, you know, I've had so many meetings when I was at ESPN with so many different managers who would come in, and I would start to say to them, look, before you say anything, let me tell you the last 7 meetings I've had. And I would tell them all the different things that I was told. And I said, I'm still here, still doing what I do. My stuff is still successful, right? It's you guys who need to fix what you're doing. When you guys can show me that you are making ESPN Cricinfo a better website, right? And you want me to jump on board with that, I'm here.
Yeah.
I'm all in. But otherwise, I'm going to do Jarrod Kimber things on the side, and you guys can decide whether you want me or not.
Yeah,
right?
If there is clear direction, it's easy to follow, right? Like, for instance, for me at Good Areas and Pro Sports, the direction is so clear that I am able to focus on my work optimally and try to do the best job I possibly can for both the institutions that I work for. And if your institution is all over the place and chaotic, then of course there are going to be problems, I suppose. And I think that's a very valid point that you made, that maybe not the form slump, but definitely the length of time that it's taking him to rectify it there could be a correlation over there. And, you know, for all the talk of him being stubborn, of course, I'm not saying he might not be. If so many people are saying it, there might be an element of him being stubborn. But, you know, we've seen him make an effort to improve his strike rate in T20s of late. Maybe that hasn't really materialized in T20Is, but it has been the bane of his existence in the format, right? Babar's strike rate. And we've seen him in the PSL, he's tried to up it. And now in the Champions Cup, even though it's early days and there's only been 1 innings at the time of this recording, we're seeing him adjusting the toe. So where do you see this unfold? I know it's a complete projection, and we don't know where Babar Azam's career goes from here. You think he's going to average around 40, 45 once again in Test cricket. But how do you see this career pan out? Because this could have been a potential legend, and now he might just go on to have that sort of arc where people are like, oh, what could have been? So where is Babar Azam ending up?
It's a really good question. What's his current test batting average?
44 and a half.
So he's played in a much harder era than Mohammad Yusuf did.
Yep.
So his average will probably never catch Mohammad Yusuf's.
Mm-hmm.
I still think he can have a lot more impact on games than Mohammad Yusuf did. And Mohammad Yusuf was a fantastic batter. I don't think we're talking about someone getting to the Inzamam, Javed Miandad, or Yunus Khan level anymore.
Yeah.
But being Pakistan players playing until they're 83, and do seem to play on a little bit longer. If he has another 6+ years, so plus years in Test cricket, I'm usually going with plus 40 as an average, right? If he has another 6+ years and 3 of those are plus 45 or plus 50, I think he gets back in that argument, maybe for the Mohammad Yusuf, Syed Anwar level of batters. But if he really wants to get in the main conversation, he's probably going to need at least 4 more great years to overcome the 4 shit years he's had.
Yeah.
Right? So eight great years is Steve Smith, right? Brian Lara, I think, is 8 great years as well. But the issue with Bubba is that Brian Lara and Steve Smith didn't have years where they were averaging 20. Right?
Yeah.
Like that isn't a thing that they did over a long period of time. And so if he had 4 more years of averaging 50 plus, he would have a very streaky record, which would it is more like a Mike Hussey type record. A very streaky kind of record in that kind of way. But it puts him back in that conversation for the top 5 Pakistani batters of all time, but not at the top, most probably. Whereas if you stop the conversation in 2022, it was Miandad and Yunus were the players that were within his grasp. To get back to them now, and we're only talking about 2 bad years, but we're talking about 2 horrendous years, right? He could still get back on that train because he can have 4 more great years. And there are holes within, Miandad plays on too long and tanks his batting average at the end of his career. Yep. My memory of Miandad is he's absolutely fantastic in England and New Zealand. So a great player of the seaming ball, but struggles against the big fast bowlers in West Indies and Australia. Bouncier pitches and all those sorts of things. So he's got holes in his career, and Yunus has some holes in his career as well, right? I can't remember his one off the top of his head. I just happened to be looking at Miandad the other day. But yeah, so Yunus has a couple of smaller holes in his overall thing. So Pakistan have certainly never had a Bradman, right?
Yeah.
But I'm not sure they've ever had a Joe Root either. Right? They've never had a player who just basically makes it work everywhere and is really consistent and everything else. And so, there is still an element where if he goes on a tear, there's no reason why he can't join the top 5 batters from Pakistan of all time. And there's no reason why he can't join the top 3 batters from Pakistan of all time. But it would have to be an absolute tear to get back into that conversation because he's 30 now.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah,
and I just think that that's an unlikely position. Whereas if you were having this conversation, you and I having this conversation in 2022, we'd be like, can he get past Yunus or Javed Miandad? Or can he get in that conversation at least?
Yeah.
And at the moment, I think like he would have to have he would have to have like a Graham Gooch career from here on in to really get into that conversation, right? A Misbah level career at the end of it. And most players don't do that. Most players by 34 are already on the downslope. So he's got 4 years to tear it up, and then maybe another 4 years where he's really, really good. And then we start to evaluate him and everything else. Right now, I don't see him as ending up as a batter rated higher than Inzamam al-Haq, right? And Inzamam al-Haq isn't like an inner tier great, is he? Like in Pakistan cricket he is, but in global cricket he's not an inner tier great. He's sort of that 3rd tier level of great, which is we're just nitpicking between levels of greatness here. Like he's still great, and I just don't think that we thought that was where Bubba was headed right? I think we thought at the very least he would be in the conversation with Inzi by the age of 30, and he's not, right?
Yeah.
And that's, I talked about this with Virat Kohli the other day of like, let's say he gets back into form, Babar Azam, and everything else. What motivates him now? Right? Is it winning games for Pakistan? Is it becoming Pakistan's greatest ever batter? Is it just having a normal career after all this chaos? Like, we don't know what motivates him, and perhaps that's what we find out over the next 4 years. But he's still physically and mentally should be in his peak right now. So there is no reason why he's, not everyone peaks between 28 and 33. Some people peak from between 26 and 31, and some people peak between 30 and 35, right? Like, there isn't an exact science to this. We just know that overall it works out to be 28 to 33. So maybe he gets to that point, and maybe we're about to see that. Or worst case scenario, he averages 35 to 40 for the next few years, and then eventually fizzles out, and everyone's like, what happened to that guy?
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting to see where it kind of goes from here and how his career unfolds. But, even if he has, I feel like he will have another period of run scoring, but maybe he ends his career with an average of around, or test average of around 46, 47 at best. I don't see him getting to that level anymore, unfortunately, but I'll be happy to be proven wrong.
But I wonder if 46, considering the paceball pandemic, I don't think that's worse than what was Yusuf, 51, 52?
Yeah, something like that, 51, 52.
I think they're quite comparable, 46 and 52, right? In the eras they played. So it'd be really fascinating to, do advanced statistics and see where that goes. 46 is a fantastic player in modern cricket, where we don't have any openers making any runs anymore. So all the top order players are having to bat higher than they have before. We've got a great crop of bowlers. We've got DRS. We've got the wobble ball. I think 46 is great. The issue isn't that 46 isn't great. The issue is that it looked like he was going to average over 50. And that's such a magical mark that it's hard to not, I don't want to be sad, but it's hard not to be like, you end up being judged against your own hype. Right? I mean, that's essentially what happens. You got Victor Wembanyama in the NBA at the moment. Victor Wembanyama has to win 3 MVPs and 2 titles to be par.
Yeah.
Right? And he could be a fantastic player who wins 1 title and 1 MVP and 4 defensive players of the year, and everyone be like, didn't quite live up to the hype, didn't quite do what we thought he was going to do. That's not his fault. He didn't write the hype.
Yeah.
Right? And it's the same with Babar Azam. Right? Like, he's just a batter trying to do it, and we end up judging them based on how I always said, this is my big thing with Shane Watson, was always that I thought Shane Watson was going to average 46 in Test cricket with the bat, 30 with the ball, and bowl 90-mile-an-hour deliveries, right? Now, his body fell apart, his technique fell apart at times, he had all these different issues, DRS came along, and it's not his fault.
Yeah.
He didn't. Shane Watson grew up where being a big, tall dude taking a big forward step was the best thing you could do in cricket. And then we turned on the Israeli missile technology, and poor old Watto's career just sunk. Right? These things happen, and we have to do that. But that's not how we do it as fans. And I think with Baba, everything is so heightened, as we talked about before. Yeah. Right? And we've seen it. Yeah, him and Vera, it's just so heightened. Everything is just like dialed up to like 100 all the time. Right?
It's exhausting, really, because the haters will double down, and the people who praise him will praise like a single. Oh my God, no one has ever taken a single like this before, and wow, Babar Azam. So that is quite exhausting, I suppose.
We've done almost 2 hours on him, right?
Yes.
And we know that so much one-liners are going to be taken away from this.
Of course.
Of the way that it's done.
And we're going to receive a lot of abuse in the comments as well.
And the opposite.
It's going to happen.
And we're going to be told we're absolute geniuses in the comments, where someone hasn't even watched the whole video or the whole or listened to the whole podcast. And there's no way of talking about this level of player without that happening, right? And it's, it's these are complicated people. Babar Azam is an important person in Pakistan society. Forget cricket. Yeah. He's an important person in Pakistan society. And if you go through athletes like that, unless they achieve the absolute greatness that they were supposed to achieve, it can be really, really dark for those sorts of players.
Yeah.
I just hope he goes off, he fixes his batting, and then he works out what he wants to do with the next 5, 10 years of his career. Or, sorry, Pakistani, 15 years of his career.
Yeah, it would be like, pretty good for him and Pakistan if he goes on to achieve the same levels of success. But even if he doesn't, look, he's a cricketer, he's a human being. Appreciate him for what he is. He is not Virat Kohli. Don't make that comparison, right? It's unfair both on Kohli and Babar. And like, don't try to deal in the extremes all the time. This is a message to everyone who's watching this. Like, appreciate someone or criticize someone for who they are. And yeah, like, enjoy Babar Azam while he's at it, whether you hate him or love him. And yeah, do let us know in the comment section below what you think will happen and where he'll end up. Because I've said 46, 47. Jarrod has also kind of said that maybe he can go up to that, Yusuf, Saeed Anwar level, but not Inzi level. So we'd love to hear from you what you think and where Babar Azam will end up. So nearly 110 minutes later, this podcast has come to a close. The longest footmarks ever. It's been an absolute marathon. And yeah, thank you to everyone who stuck around till the end. And just a quick reminder to all of you, you can go to goodareas.co and bookmark that webpage, which can prove to be your one-stop shop for all the work that we do as part of our team, whether it be written content, videos, or podcasts. We'll see you soon enough in another episode of Footmarks. Till then, you guys have a good time, and it's goodbye from us.